In an eastern Lebanese quarry, a massive stone has remained stationary for nearly 2,000 years. Neither buried nor forgotten, it sits completely in the open, accessible to any traveler with a passport and a bus ticket who decides to visit, and plenty do. What stops them cold, every time, is not the setting and not the history, it is the size. At somewhere between 1,650 and 1,700 tons, the estimates vary depending on how you calculate the density of the local limestone. This block is the single largest piece of stone ever deliberately cut by human hands, and it is not close. The quarry workers who shaped it walked away from the job and never came back, and in 2,000 years of scholarship, nobody has produced a fully satisfying explanation of where it was going or why they left. That question is what this episode is about. Not giants, not vanished supercivilizations. The harder question, the one that actually keeps me up, what were they building that required a stone this large, and what stopped them? I've spent 40 years with my hands in the sand of ancient Egypt, but Baalbek is the site that has made me sit down and stare at my notes more than once. I've worked adjacent to Roman period cut stone analysis across the eastern Mediterranean, and I've had occasion to go through survey records from the platform courses at Baalbek in an archive context. So let me give you something concrete before we go any further into the mystery. The three famous foundation stones, already sitting in the retaining wall at Baalbek, the ones scholars call the trilithon, each run to somewhere around 800 to 1,000 tons, and they were moved, successfully, set into a wall at height, with tolerances that would satisfy a competent engineer today. The quarry stone is roughly double that weight, which means the question is not whether this civilization could move very large stones. They could, and they did, and the proof is standing in the wall. The question is what they were planning that required one even larger than the ones they'd already placed. Let's start with what's documented, because the documented version is already difficult enough. Baalbek sits in the Bekaa Valley, a broad agricultural plain between two mountain ranges in what is now Lebanon. In antiquity, it was known to the Greeks and Romans as Heliopolis, City of the Sun, and the Romans built there on a scale that still reads as extravagant even by their standards. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek is among the largest Roman temples ever raised. Its columns ran to roughly 60 feet in height. The sanctuary platform, on which the whole complex sits, covers an area that would swallow several city blocks. When you stand inside what remains of it, the scale of Roman ambition in this particular place feels almost personal, as though someone was making a point, and the Romans were building on top of something. This is not unusual. Roman engineers across the eastern Mediterranean routinely incorporated earlier occupation layers, earlier walls, earlier platforms into their construction. At Baalbek, they did the same. What is less straightforward is the lower foundation platform, the massive retaining wall that forms the base of the whole complex, and in particular, the western section of that wall, where the three enormous stones sit. The mainstream scholarly position, which I want to be fair about, because it is a serious position held by people who have worked this site carefully, assigns the construction of the foundation platform, including the trilithon, to the Roman period. 1st century before the Common Era, possibly extending into the 1st century of it, as part of the same building program that produced the temples above. That attribution is based on the style of the tooling, on the building inscriptions found at the site, and on the broad consistency of the construction campaign as a whole. I am not dismissing it. But I will tell you what several of the archaeologists who've worked Baalbek most carefully have noted in print. The attribution is not airtight. Not airtight is not the same as wrong, and I want you to hold that distinction, because the whole of what follows depends on it. Now, the trilithon, 3 stones in the western retaining wall. Each one runs to somewhere between 60 and 65 feet in length, roughly 14 to 15 feet in height, and comparable in width. They sit in the wall at a height of about 20 feet above the base course, which means they were not only moved horizontally across difficult terrain, but lifted. Engineers and historians have been proposing mechanisms for this for the better part of 2 centuries, and I want to be honest about where that conversation actually stands. Timber lever systems can be modeled at this weight, but the compressive loads on the wood approach the material's limits. Sledging rigs work well for blocks in the range of 2 to 15 tons, and scale with increasing difficulty after that. Not impossibly, but with compounding logistical demands. Earthen ramps, compacted and then removed, account for the lift problem, but require an organizational effort, a workforce, a supply chain, that we have not independently verified for this site. Several researchers have proposed hydraulic assist using the Litani River which runs nearby, and this is not a fringe proposal. Roman engineers elsewhere in the Mediterranean used water as a moving medium for heavy loads. None of these proposals has been tested at anything close to the relevant scale. What I can tell you is this: the trilithon stones are in the wall. Whatever mechanism was used, it worked, because the evidence of it working is sitting there in front of you. Here is what I want you to notice about the word trilithon, though, and this is the thing the standard description quietly sidesteps. The word means 3 stones. It is a label for what's there, not an explanation of what was planned. When the site is described in general terms for a visitor audience, the trilithon is usually presented as the largest building stones ever used, which is accurate. And that framing tends to close the question they did the biggest thing. Here is the proof. But the framing hides something. The quarry stone is not part of the trilithon. The quarry stone is something else entirely, something that was meant to exceed even these. And the moment you understand that, the question changes shape. The trilithon was not the ceiling of their ambition. It was somewhere in the middle. Hold on to that. I'll come back to what the 2 quarry stones together mean, because it matters, and it changes the site's story in a way that most accounts of Baalbek never get to. The quarry is about 1/3 of a mile from the platform, and it is where the limestone for the building program was cut. This is a Roman period working quarry tool marks, channels, the whole apparatus of industrial stone extraction. And lying in it, still attached to the bedrock along one long lower edge, cut free on 3 sides, is the Hajar al-Hibla. The name is Arabic, traditional and local, and it translates roughly as the stone of the pregnant woman. The origin of the name is not fully established. There are several folk explanations, none of them satisfying. What is established are the dimensions. Approximately 69 feet in length, 16 feet in width, 13 to 14 feet in height. Weight: somewhere north of 1,650 tons on the conservative estimates, possibly higher depending on the density calculation you use. The faces that were cut are dressed. This was not roughed out. Someone intended to finish this stone, move it, and place it somewhere. Why was it abandoned? The quarry shows no signs of structural failure. The block is not cracked along a fault line that would have made it useless. The tools are not there, or at least not in any quantity that suggests a catastrophe mid-operation. The standard explanation, and I'll give it to you plainly because it is the one most archaeologists reach for, the Roman construction program was interrupted. Change in imperial funding, change in priority, logistical recognition that the block couldn't be moved with available equipment. Any of those is plausible. Rome's building programs across the empire were subject to exactly these kinds of interruptions, and an abandoned quarry stone is not, by itself, an anomaly. What the standard explanation doesn't resolve is the prior decision. The stone was cut to specification. Somebody, at some point, looked at an architectural plan, or whatever, passed for one, and decided that a 1,650-ton block was the correct answer to a structural problem they were solving. The decision to cut it came before the decision to leave it. And nowhere in the surviving record is there a document, an inscription, or a building schematic that says where it was supposed to go. Now, let me say something about why certain sections of that quarry remain unexcavated, because this is where I want to be careful. The site sits under active land use. Permitting for archaeological excavation in Lebanon is slow under ordinary circumstances and has operated under severe constraint for decades, for reasons that have everything to do with regional politics and institutional underfunding, and nothing to do with anyone hiding an answer. The Lebanese Directorate General of Antiquities is not a well-resourced organization managing a stable country. It is a small, professional body doing serious work under difficult conditions. And the fact that parts of that quarry have been surveyed by remote sensing, but not opened with a trowel, is a consequence of those conditions, not of a decision to keep something sealed. The cost of that delay is real, though. We do not know what else is in the quarry, and until the ground is properly opened, we won't. Which brings me to the thing almost nobody heard about. In 2014, a team from the German Archaeological Institute working in the quarry cleared debris from a section south of the Hajar al-Hibla and found a third megalithic block, previously unknown to the modern record. It had been buried under rubble and spoil. Its dimensions when cleared ran to approximately 64 feet in length, with weight estimates competitive with the first stone, in some calculations exceeding it. The team published their findings. The announcement made a brief circuit of the news and then largely disappeared. It was not suppressed. It was not classified. It fell between the existing stories people were telling about Baalbek. The Roman engineering triumph narrative didn't need a second abandoned stone. One was already awkward enough. The alternative history narrative couldn't easily accommodate a stone that fit neatly in a Roman period quarry. And so the discovery settled into the specialist literature, and the general public mostly moved on. But here is what the second stone actually means, and why I keep coming back to it. One abandoned megalithic block in a quarry is an anomaly, a project that was planned and then cancelled, an overreach that was recognized and stopped. Two blocks of this scale, cut in the same quarry, is a pattern. It means someone had a program, a repeating design intent. They were not cutting one stone of unprecedented size as a single extraordinary gesture. They were cutting multiples, which means there was a plan that called for them in quantity, and we have no idea what that plan was or where those stones were destined to sit. I want to pause here for just a moment. 40 years in the field teaches you more than any one script could hold. The quarry surveys, the platform analyses, the engineering debates that never quite get resolved. I've tried to pull it together in one place, laid out plain. The full picture rather than the piece that fits in a single episode. The link is at the top of the comments. Everything in one place, no hunting. Take it or leave it. Now, back to the stone. Let me talk about what it would actually take to move a block of 1,650 tons, because this is where the conversation usually either goes mystical or goes dismissive, and neither is warranted. The engineering literature on this question is real, and it is serious, and I'll give you the honest version of where it stands. Timber rollers work well below a certain load threshold. The problem above that threshold is that the compressive stress on the wood exceeds what the material can sustain before it crushes or splits. Modular sledging rigs, which spread the load across a wider base, extend the range of what's possible, but the forces involved at 1,600 tons require a hauling apparatus, ropes, capstans, counterweights that would itself be an engineering project of considerable scale. The ramp and sledge model that explains block movement at the Egyptian pyramid sites works for loads in the range of 2 to 15 tons and scales badly. That is not a knock on Egyptian engineering. The pyramid blocks were moved in very large numbers with high logistical efficiency, which is its own achievement. It is simply a different problem. At Baalbek, the number of stones is small, and the individual weights are extreme, and the two challenges call for different solutions. The hydraulic proposal is worth taking seriously. The Litani River runs within practical distance of the site, and Roman engineers elsewhere in the ancient world at Caesarea Maritima, in the harbor works at Carthage, in various water management schemes across the empire, showed a sophisticated understanding of how water could be used to float, slide, or assist the movement of heavy material. Whether a hydraulic system was used at Baalbek is not established. There is no direct physical evidence for it that I know of that has survived in the published record, but the proposal is grounded in documented Roman engineering practice, and it has not been ruled out. What the honest engineering summary looks like is this. We know a civilization moved 800 to 1,000-ton blocks at this site, because those blocks are in the wall. We do not know whether the same method, scaled up, would have worked for 1,650 tons, because the 1,650-ton stone never moved. The gap between what was demonstrated and what was attempted is real. It is not mystical, it is an engineering question that has not been resolved because the test case was never completed. And gaps are worth naming precisely rather than filling with certainty you don't have. Now let me give you the sober version, because I think you're owed it, and I think it is considerably stranger than the version that sells books. The version that sells books, a lost advanced civilization predating Rome, predating recorded history, moved these stones with technology we cannot recover, and the Romans merely built on top of what they found. I have spent decades working the ancient Mediterranean record, and I have never seen a piece of evidence for that reading that survived serious examination. The tooling on the trilithon is consistent with Roman iron chisels of the 1st century. The building inscriptions at the site are Roman. The organizational logic of the construction, as far as it can be reconstructed, fits Roman imperial building practice. None of that is consistent with a pre-Roman super-civilization doing the heavy work. I will tell you that as plainly as I know how. The sober version. A real, documented civilization made a deliberate decision to cut at least 2 stones of unprecedented size, apparently as part of a coherent architectural program, and then abandoned them in the quarry. The platform those stones were almost certainly intended for has a foundation history that the people who've worked it most carefully have not fully resolved. A second quarry stone was found in 2014, and the world mostly looked away. The engineering required to move the stones that were successfully placed remains, in the honest technical literature, a genuinely open question. And the parts of the quarry that might hold additional evidence have not been fully excavated. That is not a mystery in the conspiratorial sense. It is an unfinished archaeological record. But an unfinished record is not the same as an empty one. What's there is real, and what's there is enough to sit with for a while without needing to reach for a lost civilization to make it interesting. Let me give you one more layer before we close, because I think it's the one that gets least attention, and it's the one I find most worth sitting with. Go back to the platform wall. Go back to the trilithon stones that were placed, not abandoned. The tooling analysis on those stones, the marks left by the tools that dressed their faces shows, in the sections that have been closely studied, Roman iron chisel work consistent with 1st century construction technique. That is the main finding, and it is solid. But some researchers working the wall have noted, in certain sections, scoring patterns beneath the Roman finish work that they argue reflect an earlier hand. The mainstream response is cautious, and rightly so. Romans routinely refinished earlier blocks when they incorporated them, and surface marks are genuinely difficult to date independently of other evidence. The caution is warranted. I am not telling you it points to a pre-Roman builder. I am telling you the question has been raised in the technical literature by people who've physically examined the wall, and it has not been fully closed. What I find more interesting than the tooling is the language the Romans themselves used when they wrote about this site. Their building inscriptions at Baalbek do not describe a consecration, they do not describe a people claiming ground and making it sacred for the first time, which is language Romans used routinely and without embarrassment when they established a new sacred site. At Baalbek, the inscriptions treat the ground as already holy. The language is that of inheritors, not founders. Who they understood themselves to be inheriting from, and what those predecessors built, is a question the inscriptions raise and do not answer. It may be nothing more than local tradition that had accumulated around an impressive natural setting. It may point to an earlier building phase that the archaeology has not yet fully characterized. I cannot tell you which, and I would be doing you a disservice if I pretended otherwise. What I can tell you is what's documented. Two stones of unprecedented size, lying in a quarry in the Bekaa Valley, cut to specification. Abandoned before they moved. A third of a mile walk away, a retaining wall containing 3 stones in the 800 to 1,000-ton range that were successfully placed by people who evidently knew what they were doing. A foundation platform whose lower courses remain a subject of genuine specialist debate. A quarry section that has been scanned but not opened. A 2014 discovery of a second megalithic block that the world noticed briefly and then filed away. None of that requires a mystery in the supernatural sense. All of it is a genuine archaeological puzzle in the plain sense questions posed by physical evidence that the available record does not yet answer. The largest deliberately cut stone in the ancient world is sitting in an open field, attached to the bedrock on one side. You can go and stand next to it. You can put your hand on it, and it will not tell you where it was going. Neither, so far, will anything else we've found. I've said before that the evidence doesn't owe us a clean ending. I mean it. Our job is to read it as carefully as it deserves, and to say plainly, when the reading runs out, that it has run out, rather than borrowing certainty from either the believers or the dismissers to paper over the gap. The stone at Baalbek is a gap, a large one as gaps go. 1,650 tons of it, dressed on 3 sides, going nowhere. Next time, I want to take you to another site in the ancient Near East, where the question isn't how the stones were moved, but why the architecture was buried deliberately, intentionally, by the people who built it, and what that tells us about how they understood what they had made. It is a stranger story than it sounds. Thank you for spending this time here.